reviewing Dmitry Mendeleev's Appendix 3 to one of his books on the chemical composition books, in which the appendix was called An Attempt Towards a Chemical Conception of the Ether, and I have a shortcut URL to the archive.org location where they've archived it. They've got two, but a better quality one is tinyurl.com/chem-ether and then the number 1. So CHEM hyphen, or without the hyphen, AETHER 1. He bases his premise on a presumption which I don't even use, and that is that it's got to be lighter than hydrogen because it has to be able to not be trapped by the gravity of even the largest of stars, so that it can permeate all space. This was the notion of ether, that it runs freely throughout the universe and is not trapped by the gravity of a large star. And here I'm saying the complete opposite is taking place. It's the formation of the X and Y pre-hydrogen elements that forms a stellar body such as a star or a planet in the first place. So I'm like totally, I took very little of his premise for inspiration, and that's literally what I've done. But there's one thing I left out of everything I've said so far, and that is the slowness to which a planet or other stellar body would form, such as a star. Extremely slow. I left that part out. The manifestation of matter at the core of the hollow stellar body, and the precipitation of elements heavier, from as heavy as hydrogen or heavier, making up the shell of the stellar body in orbit around and surrounding the core. All of that is a very slow process, which takes a lot of time. It's huge and massive once it accumulates and builds up to the state that we are familiar with, our planet, for instance, or our own sun, but it doesn't say anything about the time involved, and that part I left out. And there's no need to assume that it should be instantaneous either. I mean, why bother? I mean, you think nature's in a hurry? Only we're in a hurry because our lifespan is so short. So yeah, I left that part out. Otherwise, I don't see anything in his tract that would discredit what I'm doing, because I'm totally off on another tangent. I just took him as a point of departure, as a source of inspiration, but I don't really predicate my theology, shall we call it, on a whole lot from his tract. And as it is, he was using a premise, or a set of premises, that planets and stars are solid. And that's a very important premise not to overlook. So we're completely on two different tangents. We're not even thinking along those two same lines, or not even similar, even closely similar, remotely similar lines of reasoning. It's just, for some reason, I don't know why, and he didn't, as far as I could tell, he didn't make it clear. Why did he come up with two pre-hydrogen elements instead of just one or three or whatever? One I would have assumed. What, two? Because he doesn't have any experimental data to tell him there should be two. And there were two occurrences towards the end of his tract in which he cites why he thinks there is something lighter than the ether in the first place. And he doesn't believe in dividing the atom down to anything simpler, because the whole definition of atom is that it's non-divisible, like a prime number. So why should there be an electron or a proton or a neutron? And I think somebody recently on the internet made the push for a conception that there are four basic elements: proton, neutron, a positron, and a negative positron, I think, maybe. But neutrons are not. Oh, I remember who it was. Davidson. Dave Davidson? That was his. No, he was quoting, some other professor guys. Because a neutron is not even a stable compound. Well, but here I am surmising the same thing. The X and the Y, the pre-hydrogen X and Ys, in which they get so small in mass, what they give up in mass, they gain in specialization. Either one is highly nothing more than an electric field, and the other is highly nothing more than a magnetic field. And then what was the thing? Oh yeah, the opposite, the impression on the ether that they make. So, unlike Dmitry Mendeleev, who is assuming that the ether it cannot be something amorphous and ambiguous and spread out across space evenly, there has to be a chemical element. And here I'm saying, okay, not quite. Because actually I am going with the very flow of thinking that he doesn't permit himself to go to. That it's something not materially manifest, which is not something he abides by, except for space, But then, he doesn't say space is the ether, so that's the difference. So, in order to have the materialization of matter come out of nothing, it has to come out of something, right? But that something has to be nothing in the sense that we can't measure what the something is. So then we call it nothing. But it's not nothing because it's pregnant with the possibility of becoming something. So it's a funny thing. Do we call it empty space? Do we call it full ether? It amounts to the same thing because space has even properties of equilibrium across the entire space. Namely, it's space. It doesn't vary across space. It doesn't vary in its appearance of being empty. So, it's like trippy because it's ignoring the obvious and not giving credit where credit is due. So, it would be mindful of the fact that we still have to admit that the ether we threw away, we simply replaced with space. And to say that it's zero-point energy is merely because we did that. It's not because it has to be 0 point. It's just that we're admitting we can't measure it. And that we have to take something on faith because of our inability to measure something that can't be measured. But that's not to say there aren't virtual particles that have nothing to do with atoms, that are the foundation of atoms. We're still thinking along those lines. And if I come up with 4, and those 2 professors that Dave Davidson is quoting also came up with 4, so what? It's still 4. Oh, brother. Eric Dollar did the same thing. He used, but he used in the mathematics of sign value, positive, negative, and then he used the square root of -1, and varied it positive and negative. So we ended up coming with 2 sign values for space and 2 for counter space. And counter space would be the equivalent of what I guess I was referring to about the footprint. And that you could have 2 different footprints because you have 2 different elements, the X and Y elements, that cause those footprints to occur. So, and a footprint is not an object like we would normally think. So if anything, a footprint is more virtual than is the foot that made the print. But even the 2 feet themselves are quite virtual, because I'm taking the position that Mendeleev took, that it's pre-hydrogen, that they are extremely small. They've given up all their mass, practically, to exhibit pure energy either one way or the other, either as an electric field or as a magnetic field. Now, what I also did not mention in prior videos of this series is that they will have the ability to form lines of force extending as far as infinity in space for all we care, because that's their specialty. To not behave like matter that you can put in a bottle and say, there it is, it's inside that bottle, and you cap the bottle, and you've contained the hydrogen within the bottle. A substance lighter than hydrogen that has no measurable mass, but exhibits either its existence as, for all intents and purposes, purely an electric field or a pure magnetic field, but not both at the same time, would have the ability to make up the difference for their inability to have a mass that you can weigh and put in a bottle and cap it and contain it within a bottle, and instead be capable of lines of force that can go to infinity and cross all boundaries, if necessary. The boundaries of distance, let's put it that way, because they still are electric fields or magnetic fields. Now, this doesn't explain... Oh, it does. Sort of. Tesla said radiant energy can go through just about any substance. In fact, it prefers insulators, dielectrical material. And in fact, what's-his-face? Dr. Roberto Becker provides us with the same reality. He even quotes Tesla a few times, because he said, and he was familiar with him, because he says that when a part of the body regenerates, the cells in the area of regeneration communicate with each other, but not along the neuron, but along the myelin sheath, which is the insulation of that neuron. And so they don't compete with the information that the body is already using the neurons for, which is nice. But it also shows it's a different energy that they're using to communicate with each other by, or an energy, for that matter, that stimulates the healing process. So this goes back to Tesla's radiant energy is the energy that the body is managing within itself to conduct the regeneration process. So here's something that can't be capped in a bottle, and even likes boundaries, and uses them as rail lines to transport itself from one place to another. And if we can say that empty space is a boundary, well, not so to this force, which uses boundaries as its roadway, as its conduit. Well, the only difference here, though, is that if I have two footprints, or if I have a footprint of two different natures, namely the footprint of X and the footprint of Y, the footprint of the electric field versus the magnetic field, and the footprint is an energy of its own right that can travel through a dielectric and through what would normally be a boundary to the electric field or the magnetic field, then the only problem here is I've got two footprints rather than just one. Unless I'm mistaken, such as the square root of -1 is really just a singular entity. And the sign value of positive or negative, the square root of -1, is an exterior to it. So it could be that Eric Dollard's mathematical modeling of space and counter space is actually the correct model. And I'm just, so in a sense, I'm integrating Eric Dollard's model with Mendeleev's model. I think that's what I've ended up doing. And that means that there's not really four basic elements. There's only three, but the third one, corresponding to Eric Dollard's square root of -1, or Tesla's radiant energy that needs only one wire, can take on the appearance of the component of counter space that is component to either the electric field or the magnetic field, but not both at the same time, yet it can serve a dual role depending on the circumstance, and then be qualified by its appearance as being a footprint belonging to either one or the other, but not both, of the electric and the magnetic fields. So that means there's only one virtual reality that can take on the appearance of two formats based on its interaction with the two primary. So that's interesting because that's exactly what the three gunas are in Vedic science. Namely, you have this rajas that can combine with either sattva or tamas, but not both at the same time because sattva and tamas are mutually antagonistic. And the mixture of rajas with sattva or rajas with tamas are two principles of their own in combination with the other three possibilities, namely rajas taken by itself or tamas by itself or sattva by itself, which composes the five, or the five what? Do we call them elements? Well, the five senses, excuse me. Yeah, I can't remember if in Vedic science they have 5 elements. It could be the 5 elements of Vedic science, but at the very least 5 senses of perception, 5 organs of action. There are a lot of 5s. 5 steps of progress: stability, adaptability, integration, purification, and growth. There's a lot of 5s, and so this is starting to look like the 3 gunas. And in physics, they have a different name for that. They have the creation operator, the maintenance operator, and the destruction operator. But they don't go into the combinations of them, and they don't say anything about that might be the foundation of the atom. I'm going to have to read up on those 2 professors that Dave Davidson had quoted when they said that there's only 4 subatomic particles that make up all atomic elements, namely electrons, protons, positrons, and I think the other was antipositrons, which means, by that very nomenclature, they're saying the same thing, that the positron is would be then equivalent to the square root of -1, or the footprint, and whether it's positive or negative is almost ancillary. It's like trivial, because it's still the same square root of -1 entity, an extremely virtual item of interest, while the proton and electron are not that virtual at all. They're quite physical. So let's see, what that means is that the proton has everything to do with magnetic lines of force, magnetic fields exclusively, while the electron has to do with electric fields. So it looks like it's the same understanding. It's the same basis for understanding the basic foundation of the universe in the most simplistic of terms, the 3 gunas. It's an ancient wisdom that has just been given a new facelift. So I haven't really done anything unique. I mean, I started off with Dmitri Mendeleev's an attempt towards a chemical conception of the ether, but it's been upgraded. It's almost as if it's a it's an awakening of consciousness, such that people are coming to the same conclusion in multiple instances across this planet. So I haven't come up with anything unique. It's just, but it makes the most amount of sense to keep it simple. You know, not 47,000 different quarks and all those other terminologies that I want to call them physicists want to make up about the pre-atomic matter. So Mendeleev was hinting at the same thing. He didn't want to admit it. He kept thinking, oh no, X and Y is not subatomic particles. Yet what else are you going to call them? I mean, you know, if it's lighter than hydrogen, what else are you going to call them? So hydrogen would be the lightest atom as we know it. It's just that it can get lighter. So it's not like Mendeleev was wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. He didn't realize that it's not an argument. Any good lawyer knows you have to be able to argue both sides and understand them both if you want to make your bread. You're living off of being a lawyer, or an attorney for that matter. So I think the problem with being a scientist like Mendeleev is that he took a position. And really what we need to do is integrate the two sides. And that's what I've attempted to do. And I ended up in the same place where everybody else is at. So a proton or an electron then, by that definition, are atoms. They're not subatomic. They are atoms. They've just lost so much mass. And in the course of doing so, they've augmented their unique specialization of either being a proton or an electron. But that's not to say they're not an atom. They are an atom. They've just morphed into something so ridiculously teeny-weeny that it's hard to call them an atom anymore. So we put them in a category all to themselves, and then we call them subatomic because of the nature of their interactions, how they interact. If they don't have mass, and as Mendeleev said, they don't enter into chemical reactions with other atomic elements, then by that definition there's only one thing left and that for them to interact with, and that is the lines of force, be it either the electric or the magnetic, based on which one they are, the specialty of. So it's a phase transition that causes them to behave completely differently. And I guess there's no point in quibbling over the fact that we do call them a subatomic, yet it is not a small quibble to try to remind ourselves, oh no, they are atomic because they can morph into matter and revert back to pre-matter existence. So subatomic wouldn't be the right word. Pre-matter, proto-matter. Yeah, proto-matter. That was the word I was looking for, proto-matter. Okay.